It's really a daunting task to talk about this particular topic of pleasure and architecture, from iconic aesthetics to common beauty, given that already almost at the end of the second day, there have been many presentations. A lot of issues have been put on the table, and really a lot of fantastic work has been shown. I've tried not to duplicate really the work of the colleagues who are here, but from time to time you might see one or two images by people who have already made presentations. I think also by the end of the second day, it's clear that there are two kinds of projects that have been presented. One is really the type of project which is putting the emphasis on design, on the architectural, in terms of its sensibilities, in terms of its qualities, in terms of its beauty. And I think many of the topics, in terms of the sessions, are actually crisscrossing very similar themes. In a way, given the kind of issue that we're dealing with, it's impossible not to see that there are huge sort of reciprocities from one session to the other. In fact, if anything, I would argue that it's in the reciprocities, it's in the connections between these discussions, these topics that have been put on the table, rather than their separation, that the importance of the argument more for less lies. Before we get there, and since we're supposed to talk about pleasure, one of the key people who has obviously written a huge amount on the concept of pleasure is Roland Barthes, and the famous book, The Pleasure of the Text. And in that book, one of the things that he does say is that pleasure doesn't readily surrender to analysis. And yesterday we heard from Jacques Herzog about the fact that he felt architecture is architecture, beauty is beauty. In a way, I think there is something very poetic with these kinds of tautological statements. But at the same time, I think it is important that we do try to delve into these kinds of issues of contemporary architecture and the concepts of beauty and such issues as pleasure, more than purely their sort of poetic frameworks, and if anything, actually, again, in relation to a whole host of other themes. Specifically, yesterday, I think also Louise mentioned the concept of Venustas, and which is, of course, the subject of our session today. But historically, I think it's fair to say that in many instances, and I think we in some ways witnessed a part of that yesterday, is that the concept of Venustas in historical terms, the ideas of necessity are separated from those of pleasure. And there is, in fact, now with this session, with this conference, an attempt to try and bring these topics of Fermitas, Utilitas, and Venustas in some way in a much closer relationship. In fact, I think, ironically, Jacques Herzog is one of the architects whose work really combines this notion of necessities with pleasure. But I think throughout this conference, I've also heard a certain critical reflection towards questions of ecology and sustainability. And I do feel that perhaps one of the things that is worth us discussing, despite the criticism that one might make towards the phenomenon of sustainability and ecology, is really to see these topics in a new light. In a way, if we are to accept that the sense of contemporary crisis that exists in our world today, we simply cannot say that what we have been doing so far has already been sustainable and has already been great, and therefore it's sort of business as usual. So I think we have a challenge to really open up this discussion in terms of how will things be different in the future. And I suppose one of the things that's important also about the way that we work in the context of schools is that, of course, it's very important to be completely realistic in the sense of how one practices, when you have an office and deal with the realities of situation and be as imaginative as possible. But I think the school also is a kind of bracketed existence. It's both very much based on conditions of reality, but at the same time, these issues that we deal with are also addressed in a slightly different way. Therefore, I think we have to be open to new possibilities, new things that have not been necessarily envisaged so much or thought about or discussed so much in the past. More for less really is also, of course, works in terms of its resonance, in part because of the fact that it falls in a similar fashion to a series of other statements of a similar kind, namely less is more and more is a bore, or less is a bore, which is the dictums, in a sense, that were made by Mies and Venturi. And both of these, less is more and less is a bore, are really very, they're very clear statements that have a very strong emphasis on them as these declarations in some way. Whereas when we say more for less, of course it has some of those qualities, but it's also a kind of demand. It's something that we are asking for. It's not a statement which has this finitude, which has this kind of end to it. And so, in a sense, I think when we look at, for example, the work of Mies and think about this idea of less is more, it's very clear that there is a particular architecture that is associated with that statement of less is more. And this architecture, to be very simplistic about it, is about a kind of reductive qualities, and the idea that these reductive qualities, in many respects, end up having a greater sense of quality precisely through a phenomenon of reduction. Whereas when Venturi makes the statement that less is a bore, there is, of course, the argument that there needs to be a reference to history, there needs to be an idea that complexities and contradictions are some things that need to be thought about, and that the role of the ordinary in the context of the city is something that's important. So these two variations between the kind of the Miesian position and the Venturi position, I think have been somewhere, of course, very, if not explicitly, implicitly in the back of our minds when we are sitting here during this particular conference. And yet when we say more for less, we, at least at this point, don't really have such a clear idea in terms of this particular statement. So if we think about the participants who have been invited to this particular conference, we do notice that, in fact, as I mentioned, there are these issue of the focus on quality and the attention, the sensibilities, and of course then there is the notion of a kind of activist practice, the notion of a social project that I think has been very much present in these conversations. And I think this is really fantastic, and this is very, very important. But I'm just wondering now, given, as I said earlier, the very nature of the crisis that exists, is our responsibility the responsibility to respond to the existing condition, or is it also to imagine something that is an alternative that might be slightly different in ways to the kinds of practices, to the sorts of things that we are doing today?